Right, hello. Greetings. It's Thomas Daffern here for my weekly Sunday broadcast about the state of the world. From a philosophical perspective, I will be sharing some thoughts that hopefully you'll find interesting and useful. The planet is going through a winter of the soul. I think you could say the main theme is this extreme polarization that's been going on in the world since, well, for a long time. During the Cold War, the whole era that I've been alive, which I did my PhD thesis on, but also even since then. We naively thought that with the Cold War over, this sort of bitter polarization would die down. I'd launched Philosophers of Peace, I was going to Moscow, I was travelling around Paris and European capitals, celebrating, the Treaty of Paris in 1990, the advent, as we thought, of peace. But then religious conflict and polarization broke out in Yugoslavia, the Balkans. It was continuing in the Middle East and in Ireland. This sort of, there's this strange propensity of human beings to polarize and make wars out of nothing. And that's gathered pace in recent years. Gradually, some of these other problems were solved, but the extreme polarization of the Middle East has gone on. Israel-Palestine still can't sit around a table and discuss a peace plan in civility. You still can't get Iran and America to sit down and discuss peace properly with Israel and Britain. And, then the project that we thought was the most peace, rational, sane project, the European Union, of which my country was a proud part, out of nowhere, it's a blue sky, suddenly black clouds appear and it starts torrential rain and thunder. Before you can blink, we're out of the European Union. The UK was totally flummoxed and commandeered by a bunch of, demonic forces, I think is what I would say. You see, the demonic force is the one that thrives on polarization and extremism, that generates it like a sort of war game. The quintessential figure in this is, of course, Steve Bannon, who was behind Brexit. And until people realise who we're up against, we can never heal from this. And he worked with the most extreme polarising principles in the UK, i.e. the extreme hard right of the Conservative Party. The sort of people that would have supported Hitler and stayed neutral. And there were voices in the Conservative Party that took that view in the 30s. The Daily Mail was their organ of promulgation, and they're still around. You look at people like Rees-Mogg, these are their descendants intellectually. And Widdicombe and all these extreme... what's weird is how it's been transmogrified. So I'm going to talk about that, what I call the Dialectic of History, and I'm going to be quoting some Hegel, and I'm going to try and figure this out metaphysically and psychologically as a psychohistorian, looking at transpersonal history. And how can we pick up the pieces? Because, Brexit is a catastrophe that is only going to get worse. We're just a couple of weeks into it, and the Scottish fishing industry is going to collapse. The Brixham fishermen, the food on the shelves in Northern Ireland is vanishing. Sometimes it takes real disaster for people to wake up out of their slumber. And I think the Daily Mail and the extreme right Tories have deliberately hijacked the British collective psyche and promulgated it with these extreme, nasty memes. It will take a catastrophe for them to wake up out of it, and it's happening, it's going to happen. And I think it's going to be the breakup of the UK. I think as a historian interested in karma, I don't think there's any way of coming back from the brink now. Scotland is going to separate from the UK. I've presented a plan for constitutional reform which might have kept Scotland in the UK, but the trouble is the people who seized control of Westminster are not rational. they're irrational, and therefore there's no reasoning with them. The Brexit cult, as it's been rightly called, is a cult. It's a dangerous right-wing, neo-fascist cult, actually. And it's hijacked my country, but there's no rational reasoning with it. And as somebody said, fascism isn't a theory to debate with. It's a tendency that you have to fight. And the Scottish people know this. The Scots are brave, undaunted, and are not going to bow down to this Brexit coup. They will be out of the UK. And I think it's inevitable. But we'll see. I'm a historian watching the catastrophe unfold. I've been commenting on this for some time, thinking that my rational, comments would help the situation. The trouble is, one realises these people are not rational, and the people that voted for them and that continue to promote them, they're the thugs and bullies of history who supported Nazism and support all extreme right-wing forces. They're the people, the mob that attacked the Capitol in Washington, D.C. They've been so brainwashed by their own self-reflective, narcissistic conspiracy theories of history in which they're right and everyone else is wrong, that there's no rational, philosophy has to dig deep to try and deal with that. I'm going to try and dig deep in this talk, so bear with me. So, I've been working as ever on my philosophy and religious maths book, which is my kind of sequel to Newton's Principia Mathematica. It is an ambitious study, but then I'm a philosopher in, watching a catastrophe unfold and trying to make sense of it. Hegel, lived at the time of the Napoleonic era and was watching that sequence of catastrophes unfold. Marx inherited some of that mission. We have a duty, I think, to try and understand the workings of our time. And I'm fortunate in that I've inherited, all the generations of previous thinkers and all their richness of thought all the way back to Plato and all the great religious teachers like Christ and Buddha and all the rest of them, which I've studied in enormous detail, and Islam and, all the other traditions. So trying to put all that lot together as coordinator of Philosophers of Peace in Europe and Vice President worldwide, friend of many great philosophers who are active in this field, I'm going back to Hegel to get a bit of insight because I've been studying deeply for my work on religious maths aspects of the Hermetic tradition in this last week since we last spoke. And if you're not familiar, the Hermetic tradition it's like the occult underground of European intellectual history and to some extent Middle Eastern. Hermes was the Greek god of communication. This is a Hermetic initiative I've undertaken to communicate. Mercury was the Latin name, and he was a deity who is a very, very important one of the Olympians because he conveys the will of the supreme gods to us mortals. And when the Greeks went to Egypt, they fell in love with Egypt. They loved Egyptian culture, starting with Herodotus and Pythagoras and Plato. They all went on pilgrimage to Egypt, and they studied with the priests. They went to the temples. Herodotus wrote a great, account of his visit in his Histories, which was the first ever historical study undertaken. It was a mixture of anthropology, mythology, comparative religion, and history. And it inspired me to become a historian, really, when I discovered Herodotus in doing my A-level in ancient history. It was one of the set books. But Plato studied in Egypt as well, as did Pythagoras, and all the great savants. And eventually, after Alexander the Great went to Egypt with his ambitious sort of world reformation program, he was welcomed as a god. In fact, at the Egyptian oasis of Siwa, and an oracle proclaimed him the son of Zeus, or the son of God, and he reciprocated by building Alexandria, which became the most incredible city in the ancient world, and it was sponsored by Ptolemy, who inherited that part of Alexander's empire when he died, tragically, very early. And under Ptolemy Soter, I think there was a library. It was the first time the museum was built, which in time became the world's sort of centre for scholarship. I mean, obviously there were centres in China and elsewhere, but I think Alexandria was the most important intellectual centre in the world at the time. And many great mathematicians, scientists, philosophers, and scholars of religion and so on taught there. It's where modern maths was developed by people like Archimedes and Aristophanes and Euclid and so on. And later Hypatia, there were great women scholars there as well. Now, the Hermetic tradition, which was underpinning all that, was the marriage of Greek and Egyptian philosophy. Egyptian thinkers worshipped Thoth, who was the god of learning, the god of knowledge, who'd invented letters, writing, and mathematics, along with the goddess Shishat and Maat, who was the consort of Thoth in most traditions. So these were really important deities. The Egyptians were very, very pious people, very religious, as they still are. Later, Islam said that it was just fulfilling the ancient wisdom. They acknowledged Thoth, Hermes, in the form of Idris, who they saw as a prophet predating Abraham from the ancient times. They didn't know the details, but they respected all prophets, all sages of all traditions, which is quite right. That's the right attitude to have, you know. It's what Blavatsky said in her theosophical writings, that there are sages coming in all epochs of history, and most of their names we don't know. I've tried in my book on Universal Calendar of Saints and Sages. I think it's the most ambitious attempt yet to name them all from all the lineages. But it's an impossible task, and the vast, vast majority are unknown. You know, we don't know who were the great shamans and druids of Gaul and central France. We only have a few names. And yet that was a tradition thousands of years old already by the time of Caesar's invasion of Gaul. And same with the great sages of Britain and Ireland. You know, we don't know the names of the druids of Avebury and Stonehenge, but they were there. So Blavatsky rightly says we should honour them all, and that was the tradition of Muhammad and the ancient Egyptian sages. So the Hermetic tradition is the name for that. It was essentially an interfaith symbiosis between Greek and Egyptian philosophers. And it was an interracial thing, because the Egyptians, who were partly black and had a deep love for the colour black, they thought it was a holy colour, had married up with the Greeks, and they'd come up with this wonderful synthesis, the Hermetic tradition. Now, sadly, I think it has to be said in hindsight, after all the various Gnostic schools flourished in Egypt, there were profound teachers, and the Jewish schools flourished there. Moses himself was trained in Egypt. Moses was an initiate of the Hermetic mysteries, actually. And, you know, the evidence is that the biblical text is founded on a principle of Hermetic unity and diversity. Because the idea of monotheism was there present in the Hermetic mysteries. But the God of the Hermetic tradition is not angry against all other gods. Those are emanations from the God force. And so just as Hermes brings the messages from Olympus, where the gods are, so down to us. So we need those other gods to kind of take the message. Now, they were called angels in the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, but it's the same concept. The Egyptians called them the netters, which was their word for these great spiritual principles. Anyway, so I've been studying this Hermetic tradition and writing about it in my book on religious maths. Absolutely fascinating. And I've always known how strongly theosophists and Christian Hermeticists were in the Renaissance time onwards. The Hermetic scriptures were first translated into the West in Latin. having found an obscure copy in a library in Macedonia in a monastery, it was brought to Florence, and the Medici family ordered it to be translated into Latin by Ficino, who was one of the scholars at the Florence Academy. And when this was done, this was an epoch in European history, because here was a pagan Bible, effectively, predating the Christian, synthesis, and pointing back to the ancient Egyptian roots of metaphysics. And I think when the Hermetic Renaissance therefore got going, it really got everybody excited. And it came to Britain in the form of John Dee, who knew all about this. And he talked to Queen Elizabeth I about it, and Francis I knew about it through Leonardo da Vinci and the other Renaissance magi that came to visit him in France here. And Lefebvre d'Etaples translated the Corpus Hermeticum into French. And it was the intellectual, excitement of the epoch, because what they realized is that the religions, Christianity, Judaism and Islam, are just sort of like waves on a much deeper ocean. They're much more recent, they have their own, paths of progress and their own truth claims, but they rest on a fundamental, a basis, which is much, much older, which is the basis of the Hermetic mysteries. Now this is always there as an undercurrent in European thought, and it contributed greatly to mathematics, and when it was rediscovered in the scientific Renaissance, it helped launch the scientific Enlightenment. Descartes knew about this, Leibniz knew about this, and Newton knew about this. They were all past masters in the Hermetic mysteries, and they were trying to explain it mathematically. So I'm going to read just a little quote from this scripture, which I've recorded on my Green University website. This is from Book 11 of the Corpus Hermeticum, A Discourse of Mind to Hermes. God, aeon, cosmos, time, coming to be. God makes the eon. The eon makes the cosmos. The cosmos makes time, and time makes coming to be. The essence of God is the good. The essence of the eon is sameness. The essence of the cosmos is order. The essence of time is change. And the essence of coming to be is life. Well, it's a beautiful passage. It's kind of poetry. And a lot of this Corpus Hermeticum is poetry. I've recorded this, and I'm working on a commentary which is on my Global Green University website in detail of every line, like I've done with the Quran and the Dhammapada and other scriptures and the 6 Gospels of the Christian tradition. What I want to say here is that this Hermetic tradition also then influenced, it lived on into the 17th century, it influenced, as I said, Leibniz and Newton in a very profound way. But it also influenced Jakob Boehme in Germany, who was a sort of self-taught cobbler, in fact. But he had studied the Hermetic tradition, he had studied the Kabbalah, and he had studied, obviously, Christianity. And he put together his own unique kind of synthesis of trying to figure deeply what reality is and why we are, if we are the one, if we are the good, why is the world so full of violence and conflict? And he was trying to come up with philosophical explanations for this. And that's what I want to home in for this discourse on this polarization that's sweeping across the world. Because another person that came up in that theosophical Hermetic tradition in German thought following Boehme was Hegel, who was deeply inspired by the Hermetic tradition and by Boehme. And he put those ideas into a sort of logic structure that has been incredibly influential for the history of philosophy. And I want to share with you a few insights. I've been reading this profound work, Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition, by Glenn McGee, which I strongly recommend. He's a brilliant intellectual historian. I've known about Hegel's interest in esoteric studies ever since I went to a meeting of the Hegel Society years ago at the University of Oxford. For all I know, I was sitting next to this guy. We were chatting over dinner, and he was telling me about this stuff, which, when I studied philosophy at the University of Bristol back in the 70s, you weren't taught this stuff. I've had to ferret it out independently. But now it's pretty mainstream that Hegel was a profound esotericist and inspired deeply by his studies, as was Leibniz. I mean, Leibniz, who's another polymath who I greatly admire and respect, who again we were taught in philosophy undergrad, but never mentioned the esoteric stuff. In Leibniz's work called An Introduction to a Secret Encyclopedia, or an Encyclopedia of Secrets, Leibniz tried to describe what philosophy is. What is this universal kind of thought? He said the following: this general science includes not only what has hitherto been regarded as logic, but also the art of discovery, together with methods, or the means of arrangements, syntheses and analyses, didactics, or the art of teaching, gностologia, noologia, the art of memory or mnemonics, the art of combination, the art of subtlety, and philosophical grammar, the art of lull, the Kabbalah of the wise, and natural magic. Perhaps it also surely includes ontology, or the science of something and nothing, being and not being, the thing and its modes, and substance and accident. It does not matter, really, how you divide the sciences, for they are one continuous body, like the ocean. Now, I love that quote from Leibniz. That's a philosopher thinking, right? And trying to sort of analyse the absolute. And the point is, it's like one great ocean. Wherever you carve it up, the waves change and the the ripple patterns vanish and it moves on. The point is to realise that all the difference is part of the same unity. Now, so that's what Hegel came along, and he said, okay, I'm going to make that my subject. And he became professor of philosophy at Berlin, and he absorbed all the esoteric teaching in German philosophy and world philosophy, Greek philosophy, medieval philosophy up to that point. He was like a sort of polymath who studied it all deeply. He loved particularly Proclus, who was one of the great Neoplatonists, and he wanted to understand how history is full of oppositions. And that's what we're seeing, isn't it? History is going in this dialectical oppositionality. There's the Brexiteers versus the non-Brexiters, the Remainers. And I'm definitely with the Remainers. And, then there's the Trumpists versus the Bidenists and so on. What on earth is going on? And why has the fighting become so vicious? Didn't used to be, when I started out in my early days, when I was studying philosophy in my first flush of youth, I was thinking the world was like a beautiful meadow we could all play in. Now it's become a battleground in which bodies are blowing up. Just yesterday, 2 women judges were blown up in Kabul, thought by some extremist Islamists, on their way to work. I have dear friends who are Afghans. I've taught Afghan students, and the thought that they're still blowing each other up in Afghanistan over whose interpretation of the Quran is right or whose philosophy of law is right is just catastrophic. as far as I'm concerned. You know, that could be me being blown up if I was in Kabul teaching or something. So yeah, history is full of these extreme oppositionalities. Okay, let's try and make sense of it. What Hegel said, and this is his genius and his insight, and I want to quote this. It's extremely profound. What Hegel said is that the spirit, when it comes into incarnation, because we're all spirit in incarnation in individuated forms. You know, I'm called Thomas Daffern, you're called something else, but we're all the same one ultimate spirit in incarnation. And we know that. That's our secret, right? Each of us knows we're the all. Okay. And let me quote from his work called The Philosophy of Spirit. All the activities of spirit are nothing but the various modes in which that which is external is led back into the internality, to what is spirit itself. And it is only by means of this leading back, this idealizing or assimilation of that which is external, that spirit becomes and is spirit. All the activities of spirit, or modes of consciousness, are forms in which we strive to overcome otherness. Okay, this is an absolutely crucial idea, I think, in Hegel and for understanding history. Hegel is saying, look, we're all incarnates of that one primal monad, the one, the absolute, the good, that the Corpus Hermeticum talks about as God. Yet when we come into incarnation, we appear to be other than, you know, and so we come into a world of polarity and oppositionality. I know that I'm pure spirit, and yet, you know, this opponent or this enemy or this person trying to destroy me seems to be real and seems to be out to hurt me. And so my consciousness reacts as, gosh, I'm going to bring you down. And it becomes a struggle of life and death, like the German and Soviet armies in World War II at the Battle of Kursk. You know, these vast demonic forces, each trying to destroy each other. And behind them, Hitler and Stalin, you know, hating each other. But what Hegel is trying to explain, and he's doing so based on the metaphysics of Boehme, based on the teachings of the Kabbalah, based on the Hermetic mysteries, and based on Greek Neoplatonic philosophy, and going back to Heraclitus as well, is that the oppositionality is an illusion in which spirit, however, gets so locked into it because it feels that it can only affirm itself by destroying the other. The concept of otherness is what is threatening to spirit, because spirit knows it's the all, the absolute. Well, how can that be? How can I be the absolute if there's an other there? So the ego, when the ego gets confused with the absolute spirit, the ego sets out to destroy the other. You know, rather than using what Christ taught and what truly enlightened sages teach, which is to use love. The best way to reduce otherness is through love. Because by loving the other, you realise that you're one. The self is transcendent to both of your individuated selves, and you become one greater being. Which is why we talk about the sacrament of marriage. What marriage does is it takes two selves to that sacramental place of divine unity and diversity. Freedom, Hegel stated, is only present where there is no other for me that is not myself. The will to overcome otherness is seen in all of nature. And so the oppositionality of nature is implicit in this. But we humans have the capacity to rise above this conflictual, oppositional world and to come back to that one spirit. Now that's all a brief summary of Hegel's work, the most important being the Phenomenology of Spirit, because he tried to explain how this actually works, how we can, in a sense, overcome that feeling of otherness. And I think that this is something that's very important. I will be, writing about this in my book on religious maths and in my, other teachings and so on. But for now, and it's interesting that Marx took some of these ideas from Hegel, but he misunderstood, sadly, in a profound way. He never grasped this point. He felt that this oppositionality in history, this dialectic, was not something that's subjective. It's not something that spirit is doing. It's something objective in class relations. It's what the ruling class is doing to the poor throughout history. And the only way to overcome this oppositionality is to rectify that, is to heal this class conflict. Now, I think he was partly right. I'm not saying Marx was completely wrong at all. No. Yes, of course, that class conflict is a very serious and worrying and dangerous dynamic and has to be healed. Because philosophy isn't merely philosophy in a vacuum, it's philosophy in a sociological context, in a political context, and an economic context. So in my work on commentary on Das Kapital, I've been trying to put that metaphysical bit back. What I think is the case is that Marx didn't actually fully understand Hegel. So his critique was slightly lopsided, and I'm trying to set that right. Yes, when you see the attack on the Capitol building in America, for instance, that's an example of what I'm talking about, this oppositionality, which now is being fed by conspiracy theorists online, fed, I think, by false conspiracies, deliberately cooked up by false intelligence agents for God knows what purposes. I mean, I've analysed the whole thing back to what I call war capitalism. You see, there are certain forces, the great militarist industrialists who run the planet, who want us to have perpetual warfare. Us, the plebs, the poor, which is now mostly, all the middle class. It's only the very, very elite that benefit from war. And they rake it in by the millions. I'm thinking like Theresa May's husband, who was one of these arms salesmen. And disgracefully, Theresa May just goes along with them, does Brexit, which is a project for the arms industry and the elites that run British militarism, because they didn't want to be part of a European peace project. In Europe, we say enough militarism. 2 world wars, that's enough. We don't want a third one. The British military elites have no such realization of limits, nor did the Americans under Trump. And Trump was installed by and supported by exactly the same military elites. And then buttressed by a slew of fake internet conspiracy theorists that get everybody chasing off down the wrong QAnon, rabbit holes, whilst they do everything that the military want, which is end the treaty with Iran, and make relations with everybody as bad as they possibly can, and support Israel, which is it's almost like sort of military industrialism Inc. plonked down in the Middle East to create a perpetual warfare condition. Most Israelis, don't obviously feel like that, but that's what's happened. At the end of World War I, it was plonked there, and came into being eventually as the sort of outcrop of British military imperialism. And it's been doing very well. It's been causing loads of wars ever since, and both covert and